My name is Vesper. I came home from a work trip and found my grandmother on the floor, gasping alone, half frozen, surrounded by spoiled food and silence. While I wiped vomit off her blanket, my sister posted a slow-motion bikini twirl from Waikiki with the caption "family over everything." I sent photos from the ICU. No reply, no call. But my father posted a martini with the words "finally peace." She died holding my hand. They showed up only for the funeral filter. If that were your family, would you have stayed silent? The airport was crowded, the kind of crowded that feels sticky even in the cold. I had just wrapped a 3-week field training stint in Seattle, living out of a suitcase, pitching wellness programs to nonprofit clinics, and running on too much caffeine and too little sleep. My return flight to Oakland was delayed, so I sat curled in the far corner of Gate 32, earbuds in but no music playing, just pretending to be somewhere else. Out of habit, I opened Instagram first, then TikTok, skimming for anything familiar. That's when I saw it. Sadie, my younger sister, had just posted a video, bright sun, turquoise water, their faces glowing. My mom was holding a drink with a paper umbrella. Mason had his shirt off as usual, and Sadie, of course, front and center, pouting into the camera while the caption floated across the screen like a taunt. Family goals. Just use. No tags. No mention of grandma. I stared at the screen, then played the video again. It wasn't the setting that rattled me. It was what wasn't there. 4 people, all smiling. And not a trace of Eloise. I tried to brush it off at first. Maybe grandma stayed back this time. Maybe she wasn't feeling well. But then the next post loaded. A photo, same crew, taken in front of Kalani's, the Hawaiian fusion place grandma always raved about. I remembered how she used to light up just talking about their miso-glazed sea base. It was her favorite. She'd told me once it was the only restaurant where she ever felt like a queen. She'd saved up to take me there once back when I was 21 and couldn't afford a side of fries, let alone a dinner reservation. And now they were there without her. I stared at the screen for a long moment. The longer I looked, the more hollow I felt. I tapped on the group chat, the one titled "Callahan Family." The last message had been from me. A week ago, just a check-in. No response. Not from Mom. Not from Sadie. Not even Mason. I scrolled up. The same pattern. Me writing, them not reading. I texted once more. "How's Grandma?" I stared at the screen, waiting. The little bubble didn't even pop up. I stood up, suddenly restless. The sound of rolling suitcases and boarding calls surrounded me, but everything felt muffled. Like I was underwater. Something didn't sit right. Something hadn't for a while. Grandma and I talked nearly every week. Or we used to. She hadn't answered the last 2 times I called. No voicemails either. I had told myself it was probably just her being tired or forgetting her charger again. She did that sometimes. But now I wasn't so sure. I walked up to the desk and spoke to the airline rep. "Is there still a flight going to Santa Rosa tonight?" The woman tapped at her keyboard, then nodded. "There's one boarding in 20 minutes. Last seats in the back." I hesitated. My flight home was in 90 minutes. My apartment was waiting. My laundry. My silence. But Grandma. I took the ticket. I texted Lena, my coworker and the closest thing I had to a friend in the city. Change of plans. Heading to Santa Rosa. Can't explain now. Talk later. She sent back a heart, then a question mark. I didn't answer. On the plane, I sat by the window, eyes fixed on nothing. The lights of the runway blurred as we lifted off. I watched the clouds swallow the city, the glowing skyline of Seattle fading into memory. Somewhere above the Pacific, I remembered the way Grandma's hands used to feel when she braided my hair. Soft but always steady. I remembered her voice when she told me to keep showing up for people even when they didn't show up for me. I remembered how she never forgot my birthday even when the rest of the family did. And how she once mailed me an entire loaf of banana bread with a note saying "just because." I thought about that photo again. The way they smiled without her. How easily they left her behind. And that's when I knew. This wasn't a vacation, it was an erasure. When we landed, it was past midnight. The rental car felt too big in my hands, too foreign after weeks of ride shares and hotel shuttles. I pulled out of the airport, the streets empty and slick from earlier rain. Santa Rosa looked the same and different all at once. Familiar houses. Empty porches. The shadows of memories trailing every streetlight. I turned onto the block where Grandma lived. Her porch light was off. My chest tightened. I parked across the street and killed the engine. I didn't get out right away. Just sat there, the silence filling up everything inside me. Then I reached for the handle and stepped out. The porch steps creaked under my weight as I crossed them, the chill of the air sharper now biting through the sleeves of my jacket. I reached for the doorknob and turned it out of habit, knowing even as I did that it would be locked. Of course it was. Grandma always locked up, even if she was just in the garden. I pulled my keys from my pocket, hands trembling more from nerves than the cold. The spare key was still there, taped inside the old flashlight in the flower pot to the left of the door. She'd shown me that trick when I was 14. I remember thinking it was silly at the time. Now I was silently grateful. The key turned easily. The door opened into darkness. No hall light. No low hum of the kitchen radio that she always kept on tune to that old jazz station in San Francisco. Just stillness. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. The air felt wrong. Cold, unmoving, like no one had been breathing in it for days. "Grandma," I called out, not loudly. Just enough. No answer. I turned on the hallway light and took a few steps in. The carpet muffled my footsteps. Her cane was propped by the umbrella stand just where she always left it. Her slippers were neatly aligned by the edge of the rug. But there was a glass on the floor nearby, tipped over, and a faint trail of something dried and dark near it. I bent down. It looked like tea. Or maybe juice. Whatever it was, it had been there a while. "Grandma, it's Vesper. I'm here, okay?" Still nothing. I moved down the hall toward her bedroom, heart thudding in my ears. The door was ajar. I pushed it open and froze. She was on the floor, half twisted, one arm pinned under her, the other bent awkwardly against the side of the dresser. Her nightgown was wrinkled, soaked near the collar. Her face was pale, lips dry and slightly parted, her chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven motions. Her skin looked almost blue. My phone was in my hand before I realized it. I need an ambulance now. Santa Rosa, 217 Maple Drive. My grandmother's unresponsive. She's breathing but barely. She's cold. She's been on the floor I don't know how long. The dispatcher asked questions. I answered them. I think I was crying, but my voice stayed steady. Somehow, I followed their instructions. I rolled her gently onto her back, careful not to move her neck. Her eyes fluttered once. She didn't speak. I covered her with a blanket, sat beside her, held her hand until I heard the sirens. When the paramedics arrived, I stepped back, hands shaking, watching them work like clockwork. Oxygen mask. Pulse check. Blood sugar. Vitals. They asked me how long she'd been like that. I told them I didn't know. I'd just gotten here. No one had answered my messages. No one had been home. They exchanged a look. That glance between professionals when they know it's bad. "She's lucky," one of them said. "If you hadn't found her tonight..." They didn't finish the sentence. They didn't have to. I followed the ambulance to Santa Rosa General in my rental car, my fingers clenched so tightly around the steering wheel my knuckles burned. The drive was only 10 minutes, but it felt endless. At the ER intake desk, I gave her name. Eloise Whitman. 82. Emergency contact me, apparently. No one else was listed. The nurse nodded and told me to wait. I sat on a vinyl chair under flickering lights next to a vending machine humming too loudly in the corner. The clock above the door read 2:12 a.m. Half an hour passed. Maybe more. Then a doctor approached. His face was kind but tired. "She's stable for now. Severe dehydration. Respiratory distress. Her blood sugar was dangerously low. You got here just in time." Just in time. That phrase hit me harder than I expected. "Can I see her?" He nodded and led me through double doors down a hallway that smelled like disinfectant and something sharp underneath. Grandma was in a private room, a curtain pulled halfway. Machines beeped quietly beside her. IV drips. Oxygen monitor. Tubes and wires I didn't fully understand. She looked even smaller than I remembered. I stood there for a moment, not moving, not speaking. Then I walked to her side and sat down, gently brushing a strand of silver hair from her forehead. "You're okay now," I whispered. "I've got you." She didn't respond. Her breathing was slow but steady. I leaned back in the chair and let the silence settle. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, still no response in the group chat. The last message I'd sent 2 hours ago, just read, "How's Grandma?" under it now, a new one. "She's in the hospital." I found her on the floor. She was barely breathing. No one had even read it. The little checkmarks still gray. I stared at the screen for a long moment, then turned it face down on my lap. I stayed with her the rest of the night. I didn't sleep. I didn't speak. I just sat holding her hand as the machines hummed and the world outside the windows stayed dark. The sky outside shifted from inky black to a pale, reluctant blue, like the world was waking up slowly but didn't want to. I leaned back for the first time in hours, my spine-stiff fingers still curled around Grandma's frail hand. The IV beeped steadily beside her. Her face looked softer in the morning light but not less pale. Her chest rose and fell, shallow and uncertain. My phone had slid off my lap sometime during the night and was wedged between the cushion and the armrest. I pulled it out with a sigh. Still no missed calls. No texts. No one had even opened my message in the group chat. I'd sent it 6 hours ago. A photo of Grandma in the ICU tubes running out of her arms, her lips cracked from dehydration. They had seen it. I knew they had. But nothing. I called my mom first. The line rang once before going to voicemail. Her soft voice played over the background sound of waves. "Hi, you've reached Laurel Callahan. Leave a message and I'll get back to you soon." I ended the call before the beep. Next was Dad. It rang 3 times. Then nothing. No voicemail set up. Just silence. I tried Sadie. Straight to voicemail. Then Mason. Also nothing. I stared at the phone in my hand like it might suddenly give me an answer. A sign that I wasn't losing my mind. Instead, it gave me a notification. Sadie had just posted a new TikTok. I tapped it open. It was a 15-second video of her and Mason dancing on the beach, both of them barefoot laughing. A coconut drink in one hand, the other waving in the air to some trending audio. The background was a perfect watercolor of Waikiki, golden sand, blue sky, the ocean glittering behind them. Sadie's caption read, "Still glowing." And beneath it in tiny white font was another line, "Just us." I stared at it for a long time. Just us. I scrolled to the comments. Hundreds of them. People saying how lucky they were, how beautiful her dress looked, how perfect her vacation seemed. Not a single mention of Grandma. Not a single clue that while they were sipping cocktails, the woman who raised us had been gasping for air alone. I closed the app. The chair creaked when I stood, my body stiff from the hours in one position. I walked over to the window and leaned against the cold glass. Outside, the hospital's rooftop HVAC units buzzed in steady rhythm. In the distance, a delivery truck backed into the loading dock. Nurses changed shifts. The world moved on like it always did. But I couldn't. Not yet. There was a knock at the door, and a nurse came in. Her scrubs were a soft mint green, her hair pulled into a bun high on her head. "Good morning," she said gently. "You've been here all night," I nodded. She glanced at the monitors and adjusted the oxygen flow. Then she looked at me again. "Emily," she said, offering her hand. "I'm the head nurse on this floor." "Vesper," I replied. She smiled, kind but tired. "Your grandmother's lucky you came. If she'd gone another few hours without care, this might have been a different story." I nodded, swallowing hard. "Has anyone else from the family been by recently?" "Number just me." She made a small disapproving sound in her throat and turned back to the chart. "There's no record of visitors this week. No phone calls, no wellness checks." I looked at Grandma's face, how small and sunken it seemed now. Her silver hair was flattened against the pillow. Her mouth twitched slightly as if she was dreaming of something she couldn't quite reach. She left a message on the landline, I said quietly. 2 days ago. She said she wasn't feeling right. That she was cold all the time. No one answered. Not even me. Emily paused, hand resting on the rail. Well, she's stable now. But it'll take time, and it helps that you're here. She gave a small nod, then left. The silence in the room settled in again. Not heavy but hollow. I sat back down and opened the group chat. I tried again. She could have died last night. She's in critical condition. If you care at all, now's the time. Sent. No read receipts. I waited a few minutes. Nothing. A nurse brought in a cup of coffee and set it beside me on the tray table. I thanked her even though it tasted like cardboard. Still, it was warm and my hands needed something to hold besides fear. My thoughts started drifting. I remembered when I was 10 and had the flu so bad I couldn't eat. Grandma stayed up all night with a cold cloth and a humidifier and made me dry toast in the shape of stars. I remembered her teaching me how to tie a scarf properly for job interviews. I remembered the first time I had my heart broken and I called her instead of mom because I knew she would just listen. And now she lay in this room under sterile lights machines doing what her body couldn't. And the rest of them danced in the sun. A part of me wanted to scream, to fly to Hawaii and shake them all until they saw what they'd done. But another part of me just felt tired. Worn down. Like whatever thread had kept us stitched together was finally fraying one silent hour at a time. My phone buzzed. A message from Sadie. Just a heart emoji. That was it. No words. No call, no sorry. I stared at it for a long time. Then I muted the group chat. Not because I didn't care, but because I couldn't keep being the only one who did. I reached for Grandma's hand again and felt the tiniest squeeze in return. I leaned closer, breath catching. I'm here, I whispered. And I'm not going anywhere. Not this time. Not again. Morning came slowly, gray and hesitant. The kind of morning where the clouds never quite clear and everything feels suspended in some quiet waiting. Grandma's condition hadn't changed. She was stable but unresponsive. The nurses came in with routine, calm, adjusting tubes, taking vitals, noting charts. One of them told me I could use the family lounge to rest, shower, even nap, but I shook my head. I didn't want to leave her side. Instead, I made a list on my phone. Things she might need. Toothbrush, lip balm, a warm blanket that didn't smell like bleach. I left the hospital mid-morning, just long enough to walk 2 blocks to a drugstore and a small department store. The sun was out, but I hardly felt it. I moved through the aisles quickly, picking up items I remembered her using. Lavender hand cream. Peppermint tea bags. A soft pair of socks. Back at the ICU, I arranged the things in a drawer by her bed. The nurse on duty gave me a look like she wanted to say something but didn't. Maybe she thought I was wasting my time. Maybe she thought I was doing too much for someone in her state, but I didn't care. I needed to do something. Later that afternoon, I asked the hospital about private care options. They gave me a brochure with glossy photos and polite words. I signed up for a part-time hospice care nurse who could sit with Grandma when I wasn't there. Her name was Delaney. She had kind eyes and a calm voice and promised to be gentle. That evening, after they'd repositioned Grandma and cleaned the IV site, I noticed her journal on the table. It was small, bound in faded burgundy leather, the corners worn from use. I'd seen it on her nightstand back at the house, but never opened it. Now I hesitated. Then I sat down and flipped to a random page. The 4th of January. Vesper called today. She asked if I'd eaten. I told her yes, but I lied. I hadn't felt hungry. Her voice always makes me feel steadier. She worries more than she says. I blinked down at the page, my throat tightening. I turned another. May 10. She brought me a scarf for Mother's Day. Blue with tiny flowers. Said it matched my eyes. I wore it to the market. No one else noticed, but I didn't mind. She did. Each entry was short. A paragraph at most, but every few weeks there was another mention of me. A phone call. A visit. A cup of tea on the porch. a book I'd sent. There were no mentions of Sadie. None of Mason. A few about my parents, usually brief. I closed the journal gently and placed it back on the table. It was nearly 9 at night when I sent another message to the group chat. Grandma's not waking up today. She's stable, but they don't know when or if she'll regain consciousness. The doctor said she's lucky to be alive. That's twice now. In 2 days, still no one sent. The 3 dots didn't appear. No one was typing. I turned off the hospital lights except for the small one over the sink. It cast a soft amber glow. I sat back in the chair and let my body slump for the first time all day. I scrolled absently through my phone. Opened Instagram. I didn't expect to see anything new, but there it was. A story from Dad. It was a photo of a cocktail on a table, condensation dripping down the side. In the background was a sunset over the ocean. The caption read, "Finally peace." My hand tightened around the phone. I stared at the photo, trying to understand the disconnect. How he could write those words while his mother lay hooked up to machines. While I sat beside her, my eyes raw, my heart breaking inch by inch. Finally peace. As if her silence had gifted him something. I felt it then. The bitterness. Not just sadness or disappointment. Something sharper. Like rusted metal at the back of my throat. I didn't reply. I didn't even message him directly. What could I say that wouldn't come out soaked in poison? Instead, I turned off the phone completely and placed it face down on the tray table. The room was quiet, just the soft hum of machinery and Grandma's ragged breathing. I pulled the blanket tighter around her. Her hand twitched once under mine, not quite a squeeze, but not nothing. I started to hum barely above a whisper. A tune I remembered her singing when I was little, when I had a fever and couldn't sleep. Back then, her voice had felt like safety. Like home. Now it was my turn. I stayed there until midnight. Delaney arrived for her shift and gently insisted I get some rest. She told me there was a recliner in the family lounge that was surprisingly comfortable. I nodded and left for a while, though my steps dragged like I was moving through water. In the lounge, I sat on the edge of the chair but couldn't bring myself to lie back. Instead, I stared out the window at the empty parking lot. A few cars remained under the harsh floodlights. One of them might have belonged to a nurse pulling a double. Or a patient's spouse too afraid to leave. I wondered what story they were living tonight. I closed my eyes and pictured Waikiki. Sadie in her swimsuit laughing with a drink in hand. Mason chasing a volleyball. My dad reclining on a rented lounge chair, sunglasses on, smiling at the horizon. I imagined what they said when my message came in. Probably nothing, probably just kept scrolling. And maybe that was the clearest answer of all. I opened my eyes and whispered to no one. We are not the same family anymore. I returned to Grandma's house late the next morning after checking in at the hospital and making sure she was resting comfortably with Delaney. The air inside the house felt colder than I remembered, still and untouched, like it had been holding its breath since the ambulance pulled away. I carried in a bag of clean clothes for myself and the stack of bills I'd picked up from the mailbox. Mostly junk, a few envelopes with red stamps that said, "Final Notice." I went upstairs to her study, a small room off the master bedroom lined with old books and faded curtains. The desk was exactly how she'd left it. A chipped ceramic mug held pens and scissors. A jar of peppermints sat unopened. There was a stack of papers in a leather tray, and beside it a file folder labeled in her tight, careful handwriting. Utilities, Jan-June. Everything was always neatly sorted with her. I began organizing a bit, mostly to give my hands something to do. I went through drawers, flipping through bank statements and sticky notes, most of which were reminders to call people who never called her back. Then I opened the bottom drawer and saw it. A large manila envelope tucked beneath a ledger book. It was addressed in the same handwriting. Mr. Duval. Only open if necessary. I stared at it for a long moment. The weight of the envelope felt heavier than its paper could explain. I sat back on the floor and turned it over in my hands. Finally, I opened my phone and searched for Duval Law in Arlington. His office came up immediately. When the receptionist answered, I asked if Mr. Duval was available. She hesitated and then transferred me. His voice was gravelly and low, like someone who didn't talk unless he had to. Miss Wren, I remember your grandmother very well. What can I help you with? I found an envelope at her home, I said. It has your name on it. She wrote, only open if necessary. There was a pause. Can you read me the date written inside the document? I opened the envelope and pulled out a few neatly folded pages. On the top sheet in Grandma's handwriting, it read the 12th of July 2022. I read him the date. Ah yes, he said. That's the supplemental testament she wrote after her hospitalization that year. I notarized a digital copy and held it under sealed record, but she insisted on keeping a handwritten version as well. Has she passed? No, I said. She's in the ICU. I heard the rustle of paper on his end. That document, Miss Wren, makes you her healthcare proxy executor of her estate and sole decision-maker regarding her personal assets. I blinked. I'm sorry, I said. What, your grandmother updated her will to reflect her wishes? She stated that you are the only one who consistently showed care and stayed in contact. She told me herself. She said, you are the only one who never left me behind. I felt the words settle like a stone in my chest. The house, her bank accounts, everything I asked. Yes. She removed the others from the will in 2022. It is legal and binding. I have a certified copy. Would you like me to send it to you? Yes. Please. He took my email address, confirmed the mailing address as well, and promised to follow up if anything changed in her condition. After the call ended, I sat in the middle of the study with the papers still in my lap. The silence in the room stretched long and sharp. I hadn't expected anything. I really hadn't. I never visited her because of what she could give me. I visited because she mattered to me. Because she made me feel seen in ways my own parents never had. She remembered the little things. My favorite poet. The way I used to braid her hair when we watched Jeopardy together. I looked back at the envelope at the precise handwriting on the outside. It felt like a final whisper, a thread tying us together. I placed the papers back into the envelope and tucked it into my backpack. I wasn't sure what I would do with them yet. Not until I knew what would happen next. Later that afternoon, I drove back to the hospital. I stopped at a nearby bakery and picked up a loaf of sourdough and some fresh chicken soup, even though I knew Grandma couldn't eat any of it. It was more for me a comfort, a reminder of how she always insisted on feeding people when she didn't know what else to do. When I got to her room, Delaney was reading a magazine by the window. She nodded at me, stood up, and said softly, "She's had a quiet day. No changes." I thanked her and sat down again beside the bed. The machines beeped slowly. Her breathing was labored but steady. I took her hand and rubbed some of the lavender cream into her fingers. Her skin was dry and cool, her nails neatly trimmed. I tried not to think about what I'd just learned, not to feel the weight of the responsibility now resting entirely on my shoulders, but part of me couldn't help it. What would they say when they found out Dad would call it a mistake, maybe even accuse me of manipulating her? Sadie would say it didn't count. Mason wouldn't say anything, he'd probably just disappear for a while. But none of that mattered. Not legally, not anymore. I looked at Grandma again and whispered, "I'll make sure they don't ruin this. I promise." She didn't respond, of course, but in my heart I imagined her squeezing my hand. Just enough to say I know. That evening I sat in the hospital lobby nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee. The sun had dipped behind the hills and left the world outside in hues of deep orange and gray. I hadn't changed out of the same sweatshirt since yesterday. My body felt heavy with exhaustion, but my brain wouldn't let me rest. I opened our family group chat, stared at the screen for a minute, and hit record. The camera showed Grandma lying in bed, still as stone, tubes in her nose and mouth monitors blinking quietly behind her. I panned slowly to the clock on the wall. Then I typed a message underneath. "This is day 3. I've been here the whole time." I sent it. The message marked read by all 3 of them within minutes. But no one said anything. No reaction. No reply, not even a heart or thumbs up. I watched the screen for a while, hoping for some acknowledgement. Anything. Instead, an hour later my phone pinged again. Sadie had posted another TikTok. I clicked on it and stared, mouth slightly open. The video opened with a close-up of a towering seafood buffet. Lobster tails, oysters, shrimp cocktail. Then it cut to Mom laughing with a mimosa in hand. Dad was wearing a Hawaiian shirt and juggling a pineapple slice like it was a joke. Mason waved from behind a chocolate fountain. The caption read, "No one does family like us." There were surf sounds layered over the clip and some peppy music playing. I watched it 3 times just to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. My fingers clenched around the phone. They weren't hiding. They weren't even pretending. I closed the app, shoved the phone into my pocket, and got up to walk. My legs were stiff from sitting too long. I needed air. I needed distance. I stepped outside, letting the cold hit my face like a slap. I stood near the parking lot, breathing in slowly. A car alarm chirped somewhere far off. Lights blinked overhead. I thought about calling them, but I knew how that would go. They'd say it wasn't a good time. That they were making the best of the situation. That I was being dramatic. Back inside the hospital, I sat again in the corner of Grandma's room and opened my messages. There was a new one from a number I didn't recognize. It was a voice message. I hesitated before playing it. Then I hit play and lifted the phone to my ear. "Vesper, this is Marie Buckley from 3 Houses Down. I hope I'm not bothering you. I didn't have your number but got it from Delaney. Honey, I just saw something I need to ask about. I was at the pharmacy this morning and saw one of those hospital flyers with Eloise's picture on it. It said they were looking for next of kin for a critical care patient. I thought she was in Hawaii with your folks. Is she not?" Her voice cracked a little. I could hear the wind rustling in the background, maybe from her front porch. I replayed the message. Twice. The hospital was putting out flyers. They didn't have contact info for next of kin. Which made sense. No one had been answering. No one had shown up but me. I hadn't even thought about that part. And now the neighbors were starting to find out. I pressed record. "Hi Mrs. Buckley, thank you for reaching out. Grandma's in ICU at Ridgeview. She was brought in 3 nights ago. I'm here with her now. She's stable but unconscious. No, she's not in Hawaii. I'm not sure why anyone would think that. Thank you for letting me know." I hit send. The next morning I got another text. This time from an old high school friend, Jason Ford, who apparently still lived in town. "Hey Vez, didn't want to be nosy, but is it true what people are saying about your grandma? Saw something about a hospital bulletin. Hope you're okay." It was beginning. I didn't respond to Jason. Not yet. Instead, I looked back at Sadie's TikTok, which had now crossed over 32,000 views. Comments flooded the video. "Your mom's dress is fire, this family is goals." Someone tagged Netflix. I wanted to scream. I took a screenshot and sent it in the group chat. "Just in case you're curious, here's what 32,000 strangers think about your vacation while grandma lies in a coma." Still no reply. I waited 20 minutes. Then I opened Instagram. Sadie had posted a carousel of beach photos. Her in a bikini, mom with her hair wrapped in a towel, Mason with a surfboard. The caption read, "Family first." I texted directly this time. "Sadie, you need to take those down." She replied 5 minutes later. Why? I stared at the one-word response. I could hear her voice in my head, that flat tone she used whenever she was playing innocent. I typed, "Because grandma is dying. And people are starting to notice." She responded with a shrug emoji. That was it. I felt something break. Not just anger, something deeper, something colder. I walked back into Grandma's room, shut the door gently, and stood beside her bed. I watched her chest rise and fall slowly like the waves in those TikTok videos, only slower. More fragile. I looked down at her face, the delicate lines around her eyes, the faint freckles on her cheekbones. I thought of all the times she had been the only person who clapped at my school concerts. The only one who remembered I hated butter on my toast. The only one who ever noticed when I was hurting. They had left her. They had left us. And now the neighborhood knew. The pharmacy knew. Jason Ford knew. There was no undoing it. I pulled the curtain back slightly and let the morning light spill across the floor. The reckoning had already started. And it wasn't coming from me. That night the rain started just after midnight. A soft patter at first, then harder until the glass panes in Grandma's room vibrated with it. The lights in the hallway dimmed for overnight, and the nurses spoke in whispers as they made their rounds. I sat in the vinyl chair by her bed, curled in my hoodie, watching the monitors blink. Her breathing had been steady. Shallow but steady. I was rubbing lotion into her hands, the kind she liked with lavender and chamomile, when I felt a tiny twitch. I looked up fast. Her fingers moved again, barely, but enough to make me lean closer. Then her eyelids fluttered. I stood, heart in my throat, and reached for the nurse call button, but I didn't press it yet. I hovered. Grandma's eyes opened slowly, glazed, unfocused. Then after a few seconds they locked onto mine. Her lips parted, dry and cracked. I bent lower, not trusting my voice, not trusting anything. She blinked again. Her throat worked. And then with the smallest breath she said, "You always come." My whole body trembled. I couldn't speak. I just nodded, blinking too fast, trying to hold myself together. I reached for her hand and held it tightly, not even caring that I was probably squeezing too hard. "I'm here. I've been here. I'm not going anywhere." She gave the faintest smile. It barely lifted her mouth. But it was there. Her eyes drifted again. Her hand went still. The moment passed like a ripple fading across still water. I pressed the call button then. A nurse came in quickly, followed by another. They moved around me, checking vitals, adjusting the machines. I stepped back, but not far. I couldn't let go of her hand. One nurse turned to me with soft eyes and said, "Sometimes patients experience a brief moment of lucidity near the end. Their bodies know, it's a gift, really. We don't always get to say goodbye." I nodded. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. They left us alone again. The machines beeped slower now. The rain outside had softened. I pulled my chair closer and sat down, keeping our hands intertwined. I reached into my tote bag and pulled out my old iPod. The battery barely held a charge, but it still worked. I scrolled through the playlists until I found the one she made with me when I was 13. Doris Day, Sinatra, Etta James. I pressed play, set the volume low, and placed it near her pillow. For the next few hours, I talked. I told her about the time we got caught in that snowstorm on the way to Flagstaff and had to sleep in the car. How we played 20 questions until the engine froze. I reminded her of the summer we tried to grow tomatoes on the apartment balcony and ended up with 6 perfect ones and a family of squirrels who stole the rest. I described my first crush. The painting I'd finished but never shown anyone. The time Sadie burned my yearbook and Grandma replaced it without a word, just tucked the new one under my pillow. Every few stories I paused and looked at her, hoping for another flicker. A twitch. A breath that meant something more. There was none. But I kept going. "You're the reason I paint. I never told you that. You're the only one who told me it wasn't silly." That art was a kind of truth. That not everyone can hold what they feel in their hands, but I could. The words caught in my throat. I wiped my face with my sleeve. Outside, thunder rolled far off. "Do you remember the green coat, the one you wore every fall even when it got holes in the pockets? You said it was lucky. I used to think maybe it was magic. Because nothing bad ever happened when you wore it." I brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. Her skin was cool now. Her lips slightly parted as if she were dreaming. "I'm not going to leave. Not tonight. Not until you're ready." I didn't know what time it was. Maybe 3, maybe later. The halls were quiet. Even the ICU felt still. A nurse checked in once around 4. Whispered that they'd call the on-call doctor soon. But no one rushed. No one panicked. It was just time slowly dripping down the walls like the rain on the glass. I leaned my head against her arm, letting my eyes close for a few seconds at a time. I couldn't cry anymore. I'd already emptied myself. There was nothing left to do. Just be here. The storm passed sometime before dawn. The clouds thinned, letting in a soft gray light that painted everything in quiet blue. Her chest still rose and fell, but each breath seemed farther apart. I whispered, "You're not alone." She didn't answer, but I said it again anyway. Because that's what she did for me. Every time I had no words, every time I needed to fall apart, she held the space until I came back together. She never rushed me. Never asked me to be anyone else. So I stayed. That morning, as the sun crept back into the world and the sky began to pale, I held her hand tighter, knowing I couldn't hold her forever. But I would hold on for just a little while longer. The sun had barely risen when the monitor went flat. It didn't beep loudly. It just stopped. A nurse came in and turned it off without a word. She checked Grandma's pulse, nodded gently, then placed a hand on my shoulder before stepping out to make the call. I sat there for a few more minutes holding a hand that no longer held me back. The silence wasn't new, but this time it was final. They gave me time. No one rushed me. When the staff came to prepare her, I stepped into the hallway. The rain from the night before had cleared, leaving a thin layer of mist hanging in the air outside. I opened the window just enough to let it drift in. It smelled like wet earth and lavender lotion. I made the first call to the funeral home. Then to the local church where she used to volunteer every second Sunday. Pastor Eileen remembered her voice before her name. Said she'd make space for a small service on Saturday morning. I said that would be perfect. Then I texted the family group chat. Eloise Holt passed peacefully this morning at 6:08 a.m. Funeral service will be held at Westfield Grace Chapel on Saturday at 10 a.m. No one replied. Friday was spent making arrangements. Choosing the photo for the memorial board. Printing programs. Selecting music she loved. I picked Moon River for the closing hymn, and I told the florist to leave out lilies. She hated how they smelled like hospitals. Instead, I asked for wildflowers. Like the ones we used to pick near that creek behind her old apartment complex in Tempe. The night before the service, I didn't sleep. I ironed my dress, polished her rings, and reread the eulogy I wrote 5 times. I didn't cry. That would come later. Or maybe it wouldn't. Saturday morning was clear. The sky, an impossible shade of blue, like someone had ordered the perfect backdrop just for her. The chapel was small, sunlit with wooden pews and windows that faced east. At 9:40, the first familiar face appeared. Aunt Marla. Then Uncle Dean. Then my mother. Then Sadie. She wore a black dress tight enough for a cocktail party and heels too tall for a church aisle. Her makeup was flawless. She had styled her hair into gentle waves that brushed her shoulders just as the live stream began. I saw the phone in her hand before she sat. Ring light clipped to her bag strap, perfectly angled. She whispered into the mic. Her voice dripping with grief for the algorithm. She panned slowly across the chapel. Family has gathered here in Mesa to say goodbye to our beloved Grandma Eloise. She was. She paused for effect. A bright light in our lives. I stared from the front row, hands gripping the folded paper in my lap. The pews were only half full. A few neighbors from Grandma's building. Pastor Eileen and her wife. 2 of the nurses from hospice care. And then our family sitting in a row behind me. All dressed in black, all quiet, like nothing had happened. Like they had not left her to die alone while they danced on beaches in Waikiki. At 10:02 the service began. Pastor Eileen read from Corinthians. Love is patient, love is kind. Grandma had that verse pinned on her fridge for years. Right next to the coupon for 10% off oil changes. When the music started playing, Sadie leaned back, slightly adjusted her phone, and activated a crying filter. Fat digital tears rolled down her cheeks, perfectly timed with the organ. I stood up. Walked back 2 rows. Reached for her phone. She flinched, surprised, but didn't move fast enough. I turned off the live stream, held the phone between us, and whispered just loud enough for those nearest to hear. If you loved her, you wouldn't need a filter. Sadie opened her mouth, then shut it. Her eyes wide, blinking fast. She glanced at Mom. Then at her screen, now black. She didn't say anything. Neither did anyone else. I turned away and walked back to the front. My hands didn't shake, my heart didn't race. I felt quiet. Clean. As if I had swept out the last cobweb from a forgotten corner of myself. When it was my turn to speak, I walked to the lectern and unfolded the paper. She was not loud. She did not demand attention. But she noticed everything. She knew when you were lying. She knew when you were hurting. And she never once asked me to be anything but myself. I paused looking down the aisle. Some of you left her behind. That's not my burden to carry. But if you came today looking for redemption in pixels or sympathy through lenses, you won't find it here. This service is not for performance, it is for her. And she hated dishonesty more than anything. I folded the paper again and stepped down. Pastor Eileen closed the service. The chapel emptied, slowly hushed footsteps on hardwood. Some people came to hug me, others kept their distance. Sadie never looked up from her phone, but she never turned it back on either. As I stood by the floral display, someone pressed a folded card into my hand. I looked up. It was Marie, Grandma's old neighbor. She didn't speak, just squeezed my arm and left. I didn't open it yet. Outside, the sky remained cloudless. The air warm with early spring. I waited until everyone else had left before I stepped outside. The wind caught the edge of my dress. And for the first time in days, I breathed. Just air. Nothing filtered, nothing posed. Just breath. Real and mine. The chapel doors had closed behind me, but the tension from inside clung like static. I took the long way to the parking lot circling the back garden where the daffodils were just beginning to bloom. Grandma loved daffodils. Said they were the first flowers brave enough to rise even when winter didn't want to let go. I wasn't surprised to find them waiting by my car. Mom stood a few feet away clutching a folded tissue in one hand and her purse in the other like she wasn't sure which one to use first. Dad hovered beside her, shifting his weight from foot to foot. Sadie leaned against the hood of their rental SUV, thumbs tapping furiously on her phone. The three of them looked like tourists who had taken a wrong turn into grief. Mom stepped forward first. "Vesper, honey, please," I didn't answer. She reached for me and wrapped her hand around my wrist the same way she used to when I was a kid throwing a tantrum in a grocery store aisle. "Everyone's hurting right now." I looked down at her hand on mine. Then up into her face. I sat with her for 5 days. I fed her applesauce. I read her obituaries when she couldn't open her eyes. I cleaned her teeth with a sponge on a stick. "Where were you?" She blinked, lips, parting words falling short. "We thought she was getting better," Dad said, stepping in with a hopeful shrug. "The doctor said she might pull through and we had already booked the flights," and I shook my head. "You were on a beach. You posted photos of cocktails with pineapple wedges. And she died with rain on the window and no one but me to see her go." Sadie didn't look up. She was still tapping her long pink nails, clicking against the glass like she was sending her soul through fiber optics. Mom's voice was tight. "We didn't abandon her, you know that. We didn't know how bad it had gotten. You didn't ask." Her grip loosened. "You didn't ask me once," I said, voice quiet. "Not when I texted that she'd stopped eating. Not when I told you she wasn't opening her eyes anymore. You read those messages and posted another boomerang by the pool." Dad opened his mouth again but closed it without speaking. The silence thickened. I reached into my bag and pulled out the envelope. It was thick, sealed edges still sharp from the legal firm in Scottsdale. Grandma had signed it the week before she went into hospice. I hadn't read the contents. I didn't need to. "This is for Mr. Duval, her attorney. You'll find instructions inside. I'm not contesting anything. I don't want anything." Sadie finally looked up. Her mascara was still perfect. No filter this time. Just her real face, unreadable and glassy. I didn't look at her long. "Just don't rewrite history. Don't lie about what happened in your stories. Don't tell people you were here when you weren't." Mom reached out again. "Vesper, wait." I stepped back. "Number." I stayed. I said goodbye. "You don't get to chase the moment now." Sadie slid her phone into her clutch, then pushed off the SUV. "You're making this more dramatic than it needs to be." I turned to her. "You were live streaming her funeral. With filters." "It was for people who couldn't be there," she said, eyes flashing. "Like who? Your brand deals. The followers who sent heart emojis. You think grief is a currency." She folded her arms. "You think being the martyr makes you better? I don't think it makes me anything. It just makes me present. It makes me someone who is there." Silence again. Dad took the envelope from my hand like it was radioactive. "We'll take care of it," he mumbled. "You do that." I turned and walked toward my car. My hands were steady. My chest tight, but not from anger. Just the kind of quiet sorrow that comes after you've said everything that needed saying. I didn't slam the door. I didn't speed away, I just drove. The light changed to green. I moved through the intersection. They didn't follow. And I didn't look in the rearview mirror. Not once. The first time I saw the video, it had under 500 views. By noon, it had crossed over 100,000. By sunset, it was on the homepage of every gossip blog, repackaged with headlines that read like "Digital Verdicts, Influencer Live Streams, Grandma's Funeral TikTok Backlash Ensues." The footage had been taken by someone in the back pew, a grainy recording that started with Sadie flipping her phone camera and applying a crying filter. In the background, the pastor was reading Psalms. You could see me sitting just a few feet away, expressionless, holding the program with both hands like a shield. I didn't share the video. I didn't have to. The internet did what it does best. By the time I came home from my late shift at the library, my inbox was full. Sadie had messaged me twice already. First, a short one. "You're sabotaging me." Then a longer paragraph filled with a dozen different forms of blame. I didn't reply to either. Instead, I made myself a cup of chamomile tea and sat on the living room floor, letting my back press into the sofa. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that used to unnerve me. Now I wore it like a second skin. I clicked on one of the Reddit threads someone had sent me. The top comment was pinned with over 20,000 upvotes. It featured two images side by side. On the left was a screenshot of Sadie in a luxury beachside resort laughing in a bikini with a caption that read, "No one does family like us." On the right, a still from the funeral video, me in a plain black dress sitting beside Grandma's casket, head bowed, hands folded. The title of the post: "One of these women loved her grandmother. The other just used her for content." I closed the laptop. Not out of shame, not out of pity, but because it didn't need to go any further. Still, I didn't want this to become another forgotten headline. So I opened the small digital folder I had created the week Grandma was first admitted. In it were scans of her medical records, a list of prescriptions, bills for the room no one helped me pay for, and one clip labeled simply "Tuesday 2:37 a.m. I clicked on it once more. The video began with soft breathing. My hand was holding the phone under the edge of the blanket, recording without flash. The hospital room glowed dim blue from the monitors. Grandma's voice, faint but unmistakable, came through like silk pulled from gravel. "You're the only one who visits," she had whispered. "They think I don't notice. But I do." I stopped the video there. I didn't need to hear the rest. I had memorized it. I attached the file to an email address to Mr. Henley, the estate attorney. I kept the body of the message brief. "For records only. No action needed now. Please keep this secure." Then I hit send. Later that night, as I was folding laundry, my phone lit up again. Sadie once more. The message said only 3 words. "This isn't fair." I almost laughed. Fairness had never been a currency my family dealt in. I put the phone on silent and finished folding socks. The next morning, I woke up to headlines. 3 major brands had pulled their partnerships with Sadie. One of them cited a misalignment in values. Her follower count was dropping by the hour, according to a Twitter thread that was tracking it like a stock market crash. Even TikTok's algorithm had stopped favoring her content. The latest post, she had made a teary apology video with soft piano music, had barely cracked 500 views. The comments under that one were brutal. People weren't buying it, they had seen too much. The internet forgets a lot, but when it remembers, it's merciless. By Thursday afternoon, she posted nothing. That same evening, I went to the cemetery. I brought tulips, this time bright yellow, Grandma's favorite. I knelt beside her headstone, tracing the freshly carved letters. Eloise Hart. Beloved. It was the first moment in weeks that felt still. The air was crisp. A wind stirred through the pines. I closed my eyes and just sat with her, letting the silence speak for both of us. Before I left, I pulled a small envelope from my coat pocket and tucked it beneath the base of the flowers. Inside was a photograph of us from when I was 10. I was missing a tooth. She was wearing an apron, her arm around my shoulder, both of us covered in flour. A real moment. Not staged, not filtered. I walked home slowly, letting each step sink in. That night I opened the group chat again. It had been silent since the funeral. My mother hadn't said anything. My father had typed a message but never hit send. Sadie had removed her profile picture. I didn't write to them. I didn't need to. But I did save a screenshot of the chat, for myself, for proof. Not of their silence, but of mine. Because sometimes the loudest thing you can do is not say a word. And sometimes not saying a word echoes louder than any scream. I didn't go back to Los Angeles after the funeral. Instead, I flew home to Oakland, took a long shower in my apartment, and sat on the floor of my living room with the suitcase still zipped. The silence was a strange comfort. No machines humming, no beeping. No hushed nurses outside the door. Just the sound of my breathing and the weight of grief pressed into my ribs. I finally unpacked 3 days later. At the bottom of my bag was the small wooden rosary she gave me when I was 12. It still smelled faintly like lavender and cedar. I hadn't seen it in years. She must have found it while I wasn't looking, tucked it into my clothes like a quiet benediction. I hung it beside my desk near the window where the afternoon light poured in. Next to it, I placed a framed photo of us at the Old Lake Merritt Garden Fair. I was 8, holding a dripping ice cream cone. She had on those sunglasses with the rhinestones she claimed were for church only. We were both laughing. That laugh had been real. That bond had been real. And it was mine. No one could rewrite it or reduce it to a TikTok caption. A knock came at the door mid-morning a few days later. I almost didn't answer. I'd barely spoken to anyone since I came back, hadn't posted online, hadn't replied to texts. But the knock came again, softer this time. I opened the door to see Mrs. Halden from the floor below, wrapped in her big gray cardigan, holding 2 paper cups from the coffee shop on the corner. I stepped aside and let her in. She looked around like she was visiting a shrine. "I heard about Eloise," she said quietly, setting the cups on my table. "She always talked about her tulips. Said you helped her plant them one year, even though your allergies were acting up." I smiled, surprised by the memory. I had forgotten that. The way her garden gloves swallowed my hands, the sneezing fits, the way she bribed me with peach cobbler to keep going. Mrs. Halden sat down on the couch like she'd been waiting for me to let her. She didn't ask what happened. She just talked about the tulips, about the time she and my grandmother tried to host a book club that turned into a wine club instead, about how Eloise used to leave handwritten poems in the elevator for no reason other than to make people smile. "She always knew when someone was hurting," Mrs. Halden said after a while. "You could be wearing your best dress and your widest smile, and she'd still lean in and ask if you'd slept at all." That night, I walked down to the corner florist and bought 3 small pots of tulips. I didn't know what I'd do with them. I just needed something living in the room. The voicemail came the next afternoon. It was from my mother. Her voice was tight, the way it always was when she was trying too hard not to cry or scream. "I just thought maybe we could talk. I don't know what you want from me anymore, Vesper. I know things weren't perfect. But I was grieving too. You think you were the only one who loved her. You think I didn't care." There was a pause. Then she sighed. "I saw the video, okay, the one Sadie took. You think that's what we are, filters and fake crying. That's not fair." Another pause. A sharper tone this time, but of course you don't call back. You just go quiet like always. Like silence is nobler than conflict. Well, silence cuts too, you know. The message ended there, no goodbye. I didn't save it, but I didn't delete it either. It just stayed. Like so many things they left behind. The letters my grandmother wrote that no one else knew about. The clip from the hospital of her squeezing my hand in those last lucid minutes. The ache in my chest every time I passed the bakery where she used to buy me lemon scones and tell me to sit up straight. I didn't reply to Sadie either. Her texts had shifted from accusatory to apologetic to strangely vague, as if she couldn't decide whether to beg for forgiveness or pretend nothing had happened. I let the messages pile up without opening them. Instead, I called my lawyer and asked him to file the documentation to transfer full estate control per the final will. I didn't want the house in Santa Rosa. I didn't want the jewelry or the antiques or the savings account my grandmother had quietly built over years of coupon clipping and wise investments. But I did want the scholarship fund she'd written into her will. The one no one else knew about. The one meant to help girls from our old neighborhood go to college. She called it the Garden Window Fund. I renamed it the Eloise Turner Legacy. And I added a note in her voice. Always make room for someone else's growth. That was what she did for me. She saw the bruises I never voiced, the ache I tried to camouflage with excellence and detachment. She didn't fix me. She didn't tell me what to do. She just stayed. Even when it was hard. Even when everyone else said I was too much, too cold, too angry, too distant. She made space. And now for the first time I could too. I took a breath that felt like mine, not stolen. Not held back. Not waiting for permission. Just mine. The tulips on my windowsill had started to bloom. Red, yellow, pale pink. They leaned toward the sun like they had somewhere to go. So did I. A month passed before I went back to the cemetery. It was a Tuesday morning, still too early for most of the city to be awake. The dew hadn't lifted yet, and my shoes were soaked by the time I reached her plot. I had the small plaque wrapped in cloth under my arm, the edges cool and smooth like river stone. When I knelt to place it near the headstone, I saw that one of the tulip bulbs had bloomed. Purple, delicate, defiant. I brushed away a few stray leaves and set the stone down. It read simply, "Only she showed up." There were things I could have written. Long paragraphs about what she meant to me or what others failed to see. But none of that felt right. The words on the stone weren't about bitterness, they were about truth. And the truth was in all the moments that really counted she had shown up. When I stayed late after school working on science fairs while my mother forgot to pick me up. When I told her I wanted to study art instead of economics. When I failed my first job interview and cried on her kitchen floor. When no one else understood why silence was easier than confrontation, she showed up. I sat down beside her grave and rested my hand over the plaque. The grass was cold. The wind picked up a little, carrying the scent of something sweet. Maybe lilac, maybe just memory. "I'm not sure I was ever the best granddaughter," I whispered. I got angry. I shut you out. I ran away more than I stayed. The tulip bent slightly in the breeze, my throat tightened. But I stayed when it mattered. I hope you know that. I closed my eyes and leaned back on my palms, letting the quiet settle in around me. No buzzing notifications, no curated captions, no false apologies, just me and her. Still. On the way home, I rolled the windows down and played her old playlist. Ella Fitzgerald, Carole King, a few scratchy gospel tracks she used to hum while folding laundry. The sun broke through the clouds, halfway down Telegraph Avenue, casting gold across the windshield. It hit the tiny beads of her rosary swaying from my rearview mirror and scattered bits of light across the dash. I didn't cry, not this time. Grief had moved from a tidal wave to a steady tide, something I could walk beside without drowning. It would always be there, but it no longer threatened to swallow me whole. At a red light, I caught my reflection in the side mirror. I looked older. Not in a tired way, just clearer. Like whatever fog had wrapped around me since that first phone call in the hospital had finally lifted. By the time I pulled into the driveway, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Not because everything had been fixed, not because my mother had called again or because Sadie had apologized or because some great act of justice had played out on a screen, but because I had chosen my own ending. I didn't chase closure from people who had never understood me. I didn't fight to be written back into a story they had already erased me from. I made space where there had been none. For her. For me. For something softer. That night I watered the tulips on my windowsill and opened my journal. I wrote a letter I'd never send. To my mother. To Sadie. To every family member who called me distant while never once asking why I built the distance in the first place, I wrote without bitterness. Just clarity. And when I finished, I folded the paper and placed it behind the photo of us at the garden fair. A private truth. A quiet goodbye. I haven't posted anything about her on social media. No captions. No birthday tributes. No filtered sunsets with song lyrics. What we had didn't need an audience. It existed in the things she left behind. In the way I now leave room for silence. In the way I check in on the neighbor who forgets her mail. In the way I stand still at crosswalks to let the world rush past me without apology. Sometimes the best way to honor someone isn't in words. It's in how you choose to live after them. And I choose to live slower. More present. Rooted. She taught me that. If you've ever stayed behind while everyone else walked away, if you've ever held a hand through the dark with no promise of light, I want to hear from you. Tell me your story, drop it in the comments below. Or just leave a word. A name. A moment. Thank you for staying with me until the very end.